one night, probably the second or third night, we were all around the campfire at our own camp, and Wayne left us there for a while, and he kind of gave us this weird look and said, "You have to stay here." And he and the assistant, I can't remember who it was at the time, left and went down the dirt road and came back in like a truck. And this guy got out who was like Native American, and it turns out he was like a Navajo medicine man or something. And he came and he had like this very serious look on his face and presence. And he told us a story that has basically scared the shit out of everyone. And Wayne said this story is not to leave this campground, and it's banned here. And I later found out he was telling the truth. It wasn't. They're not allowed to tell that story there because it's too scary for Boy Scouts of any age, apparently. He told the story about what he called the naaldlooshii, and later we called the Unigoshi, but it's actually the naaldlooshii or the naaldlooshii. It's a Navajo legend. Although I'd never heard of it, and I've only heard of it since then in select supernatural things. It's not as widely known about as ghosts and UFOs. One of the things that made it so interesting is that when he told it, this guy said, "This is a true story. This happened to me and my uncle," and he had a look in his eyes and on his face that said, This is not a fairy tale or a scary story. This is something that's real, and you should know about it because you're like warriors or something." As I recall, the story takes place sometime in the 60s or 70s, and somewhere more east of where we were, like southeast probably, but it was more likely in a place called Skinwalker Ranch in that area. And if I take a look at, holy shit, that's where Skinwalker Ranch is. He wasn't kidding. It was only like from where we were, this legendary place, so only 50 miles away. He didn't say it's 50 miles that way. He just said it's somewhere around here. And for years I thought that was actually the lie of the story, but it's not. It's true. He was telling the truth. So I remembered that the man who came to talk to us that night was named Larry Cesspooch, which means Larry Whitebelly, who was a Ute Indian who came from the Ute Reservation in Duchesne County to talk to our troop that night. The story, which he claimed happened in about 1974, is set one evening as the sun was just about to go down over the horizon in this desert valley in an area known as Sherman Ranch that's flanked by ribbons of red rock hills, these bluffs of red rock. Everything was lit up yellow and orange, and then red, and then darkness began to sweep the area. The valley was once a ranch owned by a farmer and his family, but the family eventually fled the property in horror after several terrifying incidents involving unknown creatures and strange lights and farm dogs that went missing, never to be seen again. What I now know is that after the property had been abandoned for 2 decades, a man named Terry Sherman and his wife Gwen and their son and daughter purchased it, and a year after I heard this story, they also abandoned it, allegedly fleeing in terror. Several of their animals were also killed or mysteriously disappeared or mutilated. So as he was telling this story, the stuff was still happening just 50 miles away. Before getting to the main story, he told us about an incident involving a young woman that his friend had seen one time in their town. They made eye contact, and later that night she just showed up at his house, knocking on the door. So they went out walking and talking, and sometime in the night. He asked her, how did you get to my house? And she didn't really answer, because he was, way out in the desert, and he hadn't seen or heard any vehicles. And he said, how do you even know where I lived? And she didn't really answer. And eventually, she said she had to go, and he left and went home and went to sleep. Before he left, though, she reached out and plucked a hair from his head and put it in her pocket, which he found odd. But the next morning, the parents asked who the girl was, and no one really knew who she was. A few days later, he began having these dreams about a girl running wild like a dog, and then he'd see the girl in his room. But he couldn't move his body. He was terrified by a glowing light which burned like a flame from inside her body, making her neck almost transparent. The experience grew more and more frightening until the family had to bring in the tribe's medicine men to stop the occurrences. Our narrator then says that in 1974, he and his father were riding home from a tribal social gathering, traveling to their grandparents' house for dinner. So they're in the back of the cab of this old Chevy pickup truck, and his father and two cousins are riding in the back. Or rather, he's with his father and his uncle, and two cousins are riding in the back. I can't remember which way. So they're in the truck bed. They're running late, and they decide to take a shortcut through this ranch. They approach the gate, the cattle gate, and the uncle starts pounding on the back window. They open the rear cab window, and the uncle says they can't enter the valley. The narrator goes on to talk about how since at least his grandparents' time, tribal members had been warned to stay away from the valley because of these long-told stories of evil spirits and witches and ghosts and monsters appearing in the area, and long accounts of red balls of fire chasing tribal members. They all knew the stories, but they were running late and decided to go through the ranch area anyway and just drive through it as quickly as possible. It was almost dark at that point, and they proceeded through and traveled down the old dirt road at a speed of about 30 miles an hour. And they're going down this road a ways, when suddenly the people in the truck bed, his uncle and cousins, start making a commotion. They open the rear cab window, and the cousins and uncle say that there's something behind them. So they all look back, and there are several pair of these glowing yellow eyes back in the dust cloud, like 50 or 60 meters behind them. So they start getting a little scared, with all these stories and warnings about the area. So they accelerate to about 40. After a few moments, they see that the eyes are somehow even closer. The two teen boys in the back and the father come right up against the back of the cab because they're really afraid now. So they hunker down and get right up against the cab. So they have a rifle and a case in the truck bed and a revolver in the glove compartment. And they get those out and are crouched in the bed with these guns, and the eyes get closer and closer. And they can see that some of the glowing eyes are almost like flames or glowing lights. And the things get even closer and closer, and they accelerate to 45, but then they come even closer, and they can see what look like dogs or coyotes or wolves running behind the truck. And they're getting closer right behind the truck, and they can see that the legs of the creatures are moving so fast that they're like a blur and making these loud whooshing sounds. And when they get really close, they can see that all of the creatures had glowing necks and transparent throats, and that you could see like a fire burning inside them, inside the throat. So they start firing at him. The uncle hits one of the things with the rifle, direct hit, and the cousins fire the revolver at them at close range, but has no effect whatsoever. It just goes right through them like they weren't even there. The cousins are so scared that they try to get into the cab through the window, the back window, and are desperately trying to squeeze in, but they can't fit in, so they just start freaking out. So the father steps on it and accelerates it to about 55 miles an hour, and it's so bumpy that they all have to hold on for dear life, and they nearly crash. But then the creatures become transparent, and then they're gone. and they disappear. The way he told the story really put you right into that truck out there in the desert, right into the back of that truck. We were all around that campfire on the ridge, surrounded by large pine trees and fog and darkness. And we all just moved closer and closer together as it went on. The man with his beads and choker and medicine bag and long black hair was visibly shaken just telling the story. So I knew that it wasn't just a ghost story, that there was something more to it, that it was true somehow. We were terrified by this story. We all had goosebumps. He went on talking about how after the encounter at the ranch, they all began having nightmares. Now everyone in the back of the pickup started getting sick. Everyone who was in the back was getting sick, and the one cousin died mysteriously, and the other died shortly after in an automobile accident. And how they would walk by trees or bushes, and voices would call to them, call their names, but there'd be no one there. Then he told us of the Ute and Navajo legends of the naaldlooshii, the practitioners of black magic, or the witchery way, who through ancient rituals became shape-shifting beings who dwelt both on earth and in the spirit world. A Navajo or Ute native person who's initiated into the witchery way gains their power by killing a loved one, like a child or their parents. And the more evil their deed, the more power they can cultivate. Then they have to consume parts of the victim, like the heart and a fingertip, in a kind of black mass. And it said that the finger or the finger bone stays lodged in the throat and glows like a lantern. Once they complete the secret rituals of the witchery way, they can use the skin of an animal to transform into that animal and become a naaldlooshii or skinwalker. The Algonquin people call it a wendigo. It's a path to become a human demon or a cannibal witch. He showed us his medicine bag that he wore around his neck, which contained something he called bitter medicine, which could counteract the demon's possession in the witchery way, the black magic. The skinwalkers, as they're called, in their human form, were known to appear animal in nature and possess these bags of powder, which if the powder was thrown on you, you would die, like of choking or a car accident. And it could also be used in a spiritual sense, like as they were invisible sometimes, and it would smell like rotting flesh or something. The bitter medicine he had was an antidote to the black powder. He also told us of his nephew, who in the late 80s was brushing his teeth in front of the mirror alone at home in Ballard, Utah, near the ranch, and the reflection of his own suddenly smiled at him with a devilish grin filled with sharp teeth, and then started laughing, and he ran out of the house screaming. He said that the spirits could steal your face and transform into you by taking something of yours like your hair or blood or a piece of your skin. His sister swore that she had seen a transparent man with a pig snout in a cemetery, while her friend claimed to have seen no one at all. Another person had heard loud tapping up on their roof, and something up in their chimney, and when they looked up into the chimney flue, they saw a horse hoof coming down the chimney, and they quickly made a fire and burned cedar wood, and the tapping stopped. I asked a lot of questions after he told these stories. I was horrified by it all, but fascinated. We had heard of like the Hookman and maybe even Crybaby Bridge and these kind of stories, but I was extremely interested in the unknown, and I studied it regularly. I had never heard a story as frightening, anything as frightening as these things he was talking about. This was like a whole other level of weird, scary. I mean, this Native American comes into your camp in the forest when you're 12 or 13 years old and tells you this story, and everyone just listens. He's an elder, and you respect. And I mean, he was never in the camp. He came in just to tell us that, and he only told it to us. It was very intense. It really felt important. But I mean, I've heard other stories. I mean, an escaped mental patient may be scary, but it's not supernatural. This was like about spiritual, magical, evil forces, like real demons. An eerie feeling came over our silent camp, and this gust of wind came up over the ridge. And we were spooked. Then he spoke about the area, the ranch. That valley in the desert is a kind of portal to another world, the spirit world, and that many different things traveled or traversed the rift and showed up coming out of this desert. Some had once been human and others never had been. The last thing he told us before he left was that if you thought about these dogmen or these skinwalkers, these naaldlooshii, for too long, they could find you and come into your dreams and come into your mind. And then he took me specifically aside and warned me not to go looking for evil spirits or witches or demons, because he knew somehow that I really wanted to see them and know the truth. He warned me very seriously, and then he left. I now know that the Shermans moved onto the property he was talking about in 1995 and were attacked by strange forces. They and others saw transparent dogs, hovering flames, strange lights, UFOs, ghost demons, and even several 9-foot-tall, long-necked beings in the distance. There was poltergeist activity, curses, illnesses, and so forth. And they abandoned the property in 1996. So as we were being told the story, this was going on in a big way. Besides the Shermans, there have been hundreds of reports of these kind of occurrences, supernatural anomalies in the area, which is now known as Skinwalker Ranch. The ranch is currently owned by billionaire Robert T. Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace. He purchased it in 1996 after the Shermans deserted the property, solely for the purpose of studying it, the anomalies there, and setting up something called the NIDS, or National Institute for Discovery Science. The property is vacant currently, except for a series of monitoring devices and armed military personnel. I mean, a billionaire doing research for NASA gets private funding for this project, and they want to set up some mysterious fortification in the middle of Skinwalker Ranch? Like, why? UFOs are seen leaving and entering the doorway, as are these spirits and strange creatures, aliens, even giant multicolored birds, which don't exist here on Earth. That night, all I thought about was the naaldlooshii, which we had started calling them the unigoshi. I guess because we didn't know the exact spelling or pronunciation. I got into a really terrified state of being that night. And I laid awake in my sleeping bag in my tent for a long time, and I even remember seeing glowing lights through the tent canvas. But maybe it was a dream. It messed me up, but the next day the merit badge classes and activities and games and songs, they no longer mattered to me. I just wanted to know more about this. I wanted to know more. I had to.